Welcome to this Education and Philosophy podcast, part of a series introducing key ideas in education and philosophy. The ideas covered in this series are discussed in relation to their potential use to present-day thought and practice. This series draws from the book Education and Philosophy, published by Sage, to which there is a link below. In this podcast, I will introduce some key features of Renaissance humanism. The Renaissance, meaning rebirth, is widely viewed as a moment of rupture, where the shackles on thought that held medieval societies in subjugation to the authority of the Church were swept away. This period in history is associated with the revival of a secular humanism, a rebirth that suddenly produced startling achievements in philosophy, the arts, and the sciences. The popular idea that the Renaissance represents a moment of rupture or a sudden break is nonetheless an exaggeration. Since the early Middle Ages, a submerged interest in non-religious texts, particularly the literature of the ancients, had survived within the theocratic orthodoxies of the medieval state, as can be seen in the related podcast discussing Scholasticism. The transition from Scholasticism to Renaissance humanism was gradual, a process that took place between the 12th and 16th centuries. Generally speaking, Renaissance humanists rejected what they saw as Scholasticism's arcane jargon and its devotion to theoretical and logical hair-splitting. They claimed that Scholasticism had nothing to offer to the practical resolution of moral problems confronting society. In part, their critique of Scholasticism was the expression of social upheavals, including the rise to prominence of a new mercantile class of traders and merchants. This increasingly powerful group demanded new forms of education and training considered appropriate for the changed economic realities within which it moved and the social ambitions it had acquired. Humanism responded to a changing society's needs in part by arguing for a more straightforward and effective language of civic administration. The models for this language were to be found in the past, in those classical texts of ancient Greece and Rome that were concerned with the art of civility and living well. Borrowing from the ancients, rhetoric, or the art of public, persuasive, and orderly speech was at the core of the Renaissance curriculum. But Renaissance education was not only a pragmatic educational philosophy designed to furnish the rulers of the time with willing assistants and envoys. It also had far loftier aims and convictions. Alongside its emphasis on a form of training in arts useful to civic life, humanists sought to produce an education that would elevate man's cultural and spiritual condition. And it is worth retaining the word man in this context, since Renaissance humanism was generally intended for men. So, how did this emphasis on spiritual cultivation differ from Scholasticism? Well, if Scholasticism put God and the world he had created at the centre of its studies, the central preoccupation of the Renaissance humanist was man, his hope of salvation in this world. This is why Renaissance humanists placed such emphasis on civic virtue, on securing the necessary conditions for justice and order in this life. Civic order was desired not just because it could make life easier for the rulers and elites of any given society, but because only in an ordered society could its citizenry live a morally good life. Education would provide the kind of training necessary for these well-versed, virtuous, well-educated men, and it was again largely men, to help construct that kind of civic order. Effectively, early humanists viewed man as having his fate in his own hands, as he strives for the kind of perfection that is embodied in the life of Jesus. Whilst Scholasticism dwelt in the realm of God's eternity, humanism, which was equally devout, was concerned with the time of men on earth. For this reason, it became swept up in a way quite unlike Scholasticism, with the more immediate concerns of daily life. The destiny of man's soul was not to be determined by resignation to the prescriptions of priestly authority, but by active struggle for moral good amidst the threats and insecurities of this world. This active struggle against the threats and insecurities of this world was, to some extent, also turned inwards. Humanists displayed in their writings a form of introspection that was largely absent from the classical writers they so admired. Their writings exhibited a tendency to take seriously their own personal feelings and experiences, opinions and preferences. This air of subjectivity was noted in the 19th century by Jacob Burckhardt, who observed that whereas medieval man was conscious of himself through some general category, such as race, family or corporation, in Renaissance Italy he saw himself as a spiritual individual who stood over and against the world, which was to be regarded objectively. It is tempting to see this tendency to introspection as the moment at which modern individualism and the idea of the modern self, the sovereign, self-constituting subject, came into being. However, there are important differences between Renaissance humanist self-understanding and that of the thinkers of the Enlightenment. Pre-modern humanists were acutely conscious of the wretchedness of man before forces beyond his control, including fate, fortune, nature, and of man's weakness, his puniness, before the might of the supernatural being who would eventually stand in judgment over him. They were vividly aware of their uncertain place within a divinely ordered cosmos, ultimate knowledge of which was beyond human understanding. They were in favour of the pursuit of reason, but not in such a way that it would exalt man's capacity for control of his destiny. Rather than seeking to throw off the shackles of superstitious belief, they committed reason to the exploration of how man, if he was to be free and achieve immortality, should behave in accordance with the will of God. But there is some truthfulness to the suggestion that the Renaissance saw a significant shift in humanity's sense of itself and its relation to the world. Arguably, this moved man away from that rootedness in a common culture which, it has been claimed, marked pre-modern societies. There was a shift in emphasis towards an idea of the individual human being as capable of making decisions and having ideas that were not entirely governed by tradition, that is, governed by attachment to some general communal morality and worldview. It might be argued that introspection was not something new. Earlier Christian confessional practices were also aimed at shaping individuals' interiorities, regulating their thoughts and feelings in accordance with Christian morality. What was nonetheless different in humanist writing of an introspective nature was that, rather than seeking simple subjection to the precepts of a particular moral code, humanist self-culture was more discursive, anecdotal, more observant of the material world and its pleasing or troubling distractions. Humanist writing was conscious of the bonds of personal relationships and the transience of thought and feeling, and it was more questioning of how faithfulness to the Christian ideal might be achieved. The introspection of early humanists like Petrarch and those who followed was not practiced as an attempt to apply a moral code to personal thought and action. Rather, it was an exploration of how the individual's soul might orient itself towards the good. It would seem, therefore, that Burckhardt's 19th century depiction of a Renaissance man who saw himself as separate from a world that he contemplated from within an enclosed subjectivity was surely premature. That notion of the individual who stands apart from an observable reality, an objective reality, an out there, awaited a full development that took place through the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries. It followed the growth of capitalist economies and the philosophical humanism of the Enlightenment, according to which modern man must now free himself not only from superstition, ignorance, and tyranny, but also from the depredations of time and the natural constraints that bear down upon his existence. Renaissance humanism and Renaissance humanist education must be understood on its own terms, then. It was oriented towards furnishing a civil order with educated subjects, and it understood itself to be operating within definite religious and political constraints. These ideas are discussed in more detail in Chapter 5 of Education and Philosophy. If you would like to hear another podcast discussing a key idea related to education and philosophy, click below. Thank you for listening.